Okay, this is going to be a quick and dirty lecture on the annotated bibliography. Uh, the annotated bibliography is commonly referred to as a bib. So if you ever see me writing about your bib, you'll know that I'm actually talking about your annotated bibliography and not some kind of napkin you wear around your neck when you eat. Essentially, the annotated bibliography is a way for you to compile your research to give meaning to all of it. So as you're sifting through sources and you find sources that you think are valuable and interesting to you, you want to start documenting them. The bib forces you to think about the significance of each source in terms of a possible thesis for your research paper. So it isn't merely a list of the sources that you're going to use, it's also it also provides an explanation of how you intend to use those sources. And creating an annotated bibliography can take some time. Now, your requirement is 7 sources, and 2 of those sources can come from our class. So your bib is not quite as daunting as, say, the kind you might have to do in graduate school if you're headed that way. But it does make a difference in terms of getting your research paper together. Students who take the annotated bibliography seriously and apply themselves to really thinking carefully about each source and how they might use each source in the paper tend to find that writing the paper is a lot easier. So I encourage you to get started early, and I'm going to make some changes to the deadline for your annotated bibliography, so you'll want to keep an eye out for that in our upcoming announcement on Blackboard. There are 3 parts to the annotated bibliography. You'll need to write an introduction that explains your research process and how this process led to the thesis of your paper. Part of that explanation needs to include your choices about your sources. So how is it that you arrived at this list that you're presenting to me? And bear in mind that the thesis that you present in your annotated bibliography may not ultimately be the thesis for your research paper. There's still time for things to change. So don't feel hemmed in if you say, oh, this is going to be my argument, and then as you start, thinking more about the actual paper itself, you end up changing your mind about what your actual thesis statement is. That's fine. I need to know what you think your purpose is at this point. What are you going to set out to do? What's the argument or analysis or interpretation that you're intending to make in that research paper? And how will these sources help you to do that? So in your rules for writers, you'll find that section MLA 59B will be invaluable to the next part of the annotated bibliography, which is to present a complete works cited entry for each of the sources that you intend to cite in your paper. Now, it has happened where students will submit an annotated bibliography and then decide that they're going to drop one of the sources from their bib and use a different source that they didn't do an entry for. Don't worry about that. Now, if you end up changing all of your sources, that's a problem. But if you have 1 or 2 that change, that's not a big deal. But you do want to refer to this section of your handbook for information about how to cite each of the sources that you use. Additionally, you'll find page 449 in Rules for Writers valuable for creating the evaluative summary. So the summary shouldn't merely just summarize what the source is about and what the main point is. It needs to also evaluate the source in terms of your paper. So how does the source relate to your potential thesis? Okay, so you can look at that sample. Also look at the sample annotated bibliography that I've posted in the research project folder. Read the introduction, read the evaluative summaries, but also look at how it's formatted. And I'm going to pull that up here in just a minute and explain that very quickly. You also need to keep in mind that you should use a variety of sources for this assignment. So while newspaper and magazine articles are great, you should also use some articles from academic journals. Popular sources like newspapers and magazines are not peer-reviewed in the same way that academic journal articles are. And I'm going to get more in-depth in terms of evaluating your sources in another lecture, but you need to keep in mind that a variety of sources shows that you really went out of your way to find information that's unique, and that you didn't just do a Google search and cite a bunch of government documents. A government document or 2 is fine, but really, variety shows that you dug a little deeper. And it also helps to create for more opportunity in creating a well-rounded paper. All right, so just some last-minute notes here. Remember, you're researching to discover your thesis, so you shouldn't have already had a thesis all worked out before you started the research process. There's really, that's not what research is about. Research is to learn something new, not to just set out to prove a point. You also want to really think critically about the sources that you choose. Again, I'll be providing another lecture that addresses that in more detail. Use a range of sources, a variety of sources, and also make sure that you keep really good notes. If sources are short enough, you can just print them out so you can highlight sections that you think you want to quote. If sources are longer, if they're book sources, or if it's just a really long article, then you might want to start a running document wherein you kind of copy and paste passages from that you want to use in your paper, but make sure that you document page numbers and author and all of that information so that it's you're not plagiarizing, and so that later you don't have to go back and try to figure out, where did I get this quote from? So good notes are imperative. And if you haven't already gotten started documenting some of your sources, make sure that you do that now. All right, I wanted to show you the sample. Okay, so this is from the student whose proposal I posted. So you can see how we went from her proposal questions, her proposal research questions, to what happened when she started conducting research. And you'll see she ends up with a lot more questions, but then she kind of, arrives at some kind of a starting point for her paper. And she really underwent a huge thought process. And so I'm also going to be posting her research paper so you can see how the final version of it all turned out. But this provides a pretty stellar example of how to format the page. And you'll notice if we go back to page 1, the traditional heading with her name, my name, the course, and then the date. And you would put the date that you submit it. Okay, so and then also you need to give your bib a title. Don't just call it Annotated Bibliography. Give it some kind of title that orients us to the subject matter, or if you are pretty confident at this point what your thesis might be, you might point to the argument that you're planning to make. Hers is pretty general, but it's still a step up from just Annotated Bibliography. You want the title to speak to your topic and kind of your individual perspective on the topic. So again, you want to make sure that you have your last name and the page number in the upper right hand corner adhering to MLA guidelines. You'll notice there are no additional spaces between her heading and her title, no additional spaces between her title and the introduction. And everything is double spaced. It is fine to include an additional space between the introduction and the first citation, and also between citations. It helps to just make it easier to find, when we're moving from one source to the next. You'll notice that the sources are alphabetized, and that the evaluative summaries appear directly underneath the source citation. And of course, make sure that, just as she has done, that you explain in a sentence or two how the source is going to be used in your paper. So this is available on the research project. It's in the research project folder. And you can print it out if you want to, or you can just read it online, and that will help give you a sense of what you're aiming for in your own proposal. All right, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to post them on our forum or send me an email.